It's a school night in 1964, well past your bedtime, and you are lying in the dark, under the blankets, with a small plastic box pressed against your pillow. A single earphone runs from the box to your ear. One ear, mono, a little plug the size of a pea. The house is asleep, the light is off, and you are slowly, carefully turning a tiny serrated wheel on the side of the box, sweeping across the AM dial, listening through a wash of static and whistles for something to grab onto. And then it comes. A voice swims up out of the noise, a disc jockey, fast and electric, talking over the intro to a song. The station is hundreds of miles away. It's in a city you have never seen. The song is rock and roll, the kind your parents don't quite approve of, and that is playing right now in your ear, in the dark, just for you, while the whole world sleeps around you. That little box cost a few dollars. It ran on a 9-volt battery, and it did something no machine had ever done before it. It put the entire world into the palm of a child's hand, privately, portably, anywhere. This is a story of the Transistor radio. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from. If you owned one, the memories are tactile before they're anything else. You remember the cheap, light plastic, red or black or a creamy ivory, warm in your hand. You remember the little leather or vinyl case it came in, with the cutouts for the dial and the speaker, and the strap so you could carry it. You remember the single earphone, a hard little plug with a clear coiled wire, and the tinny, thin, glorious sound that came out of it. You remember thumbing the volume wheel and the tuning wheel, hunting across the dial by feel. You remember where you took it, to the beach, propped on a towel, surf and top 40 mixing together, onto your bike, out to the backyard, to the ball game so you could hear the announcer call the same play you were watching, and into bed, every night, the most private place of all. It didn't sound good. It crackled and faded and drifted. The fidelity was terrible. But that was never the point. The point was that it was yours, and it went everywhere. And through that one little earphone, the world came to you. To understand why that little box mattered so much, you have to remember what radio had been before it. For 30 years, radio was furniture. It was a big wooden console in the living room, a piece of cabinetry as large as a dresser, glowing with warm vacuum tubes anchored to a wall socket. And it was shared. The whole family gathered around that one set in the evening, gathered for the president's fireside chats during the Depression and the war, gathered for the comedies and the dramas and the Lone Ranger. Radio was a collective, communal, household event. You listened to what the family listened to, in the room where the family sat. That little shift from we to me, from the living room to the pillow, changed American life more than almost anyone realized. Here's the claim that this little plastic toy deserves and almost never gets. That cheap transistor radio was the leading edge of the entire modern world. It was the very first consumer product built on the transistor, the invention that would become the microchip, the computer, and eventually the phone in your pocket right now. The device under your pillow was step one of the silicon age. One of the founders of Apple has said the transistor radio was among the machines that inspired him. It was also a social earthquake. It handed a whole generation of teenagers their own private soundtrack at the exact moment rock and roll was being born, and that combination helped light the fuse on the entire youth culture of the 1950s and 60s. And there's a twist most people never hear. America invented this thing, the transistor radio, all with it. And then, within a few short years, quietly handed the entire industry to Japan. It all started with a component nobody could find the use for. The transistor was born in December 1947 at Bell Labs in New Jersey, invented by 3 physicists who would later win the Nobel Prize for it. It was a tiny sliver of semiconductor that could do the job of a bulky, fragile, power-hungry vacuum tube, but in a fraction of the space, with a fraction of the power, and with no glowing filament to burn out. It should have changed everything overnight. It didn't. For years, the transistor sat mostly unused in consumer products because it was expensive. around $20 a piece when a vacuum tube cost about $1, and finicky to make. Just about the only place it showed up was in hearing aids. A Texas company called Texas Instruments saw the opportunity. If they could get transistors into a popular consumer product, demand would soar and the price would fall. They built a working prototype of a transistor radio and went shopping for a manufacturer to make it. And every major radio company in America turned them down. RCA, the giants of the industry. None of them wanted to gamble on this strange new thing. The big names said no. So, a tiny company said yes. The company that took the gamble was a small outfit in Indianapolis called IDEA, Industrial Development Engineering Associates, which until then had been making TV antenna boosters. Through its Regency division, it agreed to build the radio Texas Instruments couldn't get anyone else to touch. On October 18, 1954, they announced it. The Regency TR-1, the first commercially sold transistor radio in the world. By November, it was in stores in New York and Los Angeles, just in time for Christmas. It was about the size of a deck of cards, weighed a few ounces, ran on a battery, and turned on instantly. No warm-up, no glowing tubes. Inside were just 4 Texas Instruments transistors. It cost $49.95. That was a lot of money in 1954, more than a week's wages for many Americans. In an era when coins were still real silver, you were handing over the equivalent of 50 silver dollars for a tiny, unproven novelty with mediocre sound, and people bought it anyway. The first production runs sold out. Around 100,000 of them moved in the first year. If you had one, you were, as one magazine put it, the coolest thing going. The TR-1's sound may have been thin, but its look was pure future. And that was no accident. Texas Instruments and Regency handed the design of the case to a small team of Chicago industrial designers, working under brutal time pressure to hit the Christmas deadline. They created the whole thing in about 6 weeks, trading sketches back and forth by mail and phone. The result was a sleek, jewel-like little object in mid-century colors, ivory, black, gray, mandarin red, that looked like it had dropped in from a decade that hadn't happened yet. The perforated grille over the speaker, the story goes, was inspired by the pegboard wall in their own office. There was one detail that quietly marked the era it was born into. On the tuning dial, 2 little triangles mark specific frequencies, the civil defense channels, there so you could find emergency broadcasts during a Cold War bomb drill. A pocket radio for rock and roll, with the shadow of the atomic age printed right on its face. The TR-1 was expensive and imperfect, but it proved the idea. And once the idea was loose, the radios got smaller, better, and cheaper fast. And as they spread, they collided with something happening at the exact same moment, the birth of rock and roll. This was the real revolution, and it was social, not technical. Up to now, a teenager listened to whatever played on the family console, in the family living room, under the family's rules. But a transistor radio you could carry and meant a teenager could finally listen to their own music, the loud, thrilling, slightly dangerous new sound that parents distrusted, anywhere, anytime, with no one able to stop them. As one historian put it, it was the first time in history that kids could listen to their own music and nobody could tell them not to. Suddenly, there were transistor radios on every beach towel, in every pocket, pressed to every teenage ear. The radio went with you to places adults weren't. It became the soundtrack of a generation that was, for the first time, claiming a culture of its own. And at night, that little radio could do something close to magic. Here's the part that anyone who did it never forgot: the small, nightly miracle. During the day, an AM radio could only reach the stations nearby. But at night, something changes in the sky. The layer of the upper atmosphere that absorbs AM signals during the day thins out after dark, and suddenly those signals can bounce off the ionosphere and skip enormous distances, hundreds of miles, sometimes 1,000 or more. So a kid lying in bed in a small town in Ohio, slowly working that little tuning wheel, could pull in a powerful clear channel station from Chicago, from Nashville, from Del Rio, from cities they had never visited and might never see. a ball game from across the country, a late-night disc jockey spinning records in a studio half a continent away, his voice fading in and out as the signal rode the night air. Think about what that was for a child, before the internet, before any of it. You were lying in the dark, catching invisible waves out of nowhere, listening to a living human voice from a place impossibly far away, and you'd caught it yourself with a $5 box and a piece of wire. The whole world in your ear, in the dark. That nightly ritual is burned into a whole generation's memory, and it's almost always the same scene. You waited until the house was quiet. You kept the volume low and used a single earphone so your parents wouldn't hear and tell you to go to sleep. You hid the little glow of the dial under the blanket, and you went hunting, patiently, through the static, for something far away. A favorite DJ, a song you'd been waiting all day to hear, a team you loved playing 1,000 miles from your bedroom. And almost everyone who did it has one memory that's stuck. The most distant station they ever caught. The night the signal came in clear from somewhere it had no business reaching. The song that was playing when it did. So tell everyone in the comments, what's the farthest station you ever pulled in on a transistor radio at night? And where were you lying when you caught it? Somebody reading this was tuned to the very same frequency, hundreds of miles away, on the very same night. While America had invented the transistor radio, the country that would master it was on the other side of the world and still digging out of the rubble of a lost war. In Tokyo, a tiny electronics company with only a handful of employees watched the Regency TR-1 with intense interest. They built their own first transistor radio in 1955, and they did something the Americans hadn't. They manufactured the transistors and components themselves. For their new product, they adopted a brand name simple enough for Americans to pronounce. They called themselves Sony. Then, in 1957, Sony released the TR-63, smaller than the American radios, lighter, more reliable, and deliberately built for export to the United States. It used a new, smaller 9-volt battery that would go on to become the standard for the whole industry. It was the first transistor radio to sell in the millions, eventually moving around 7 million units worldwide. That little radio did more than make money. It launched Sony as a global giant, and it began to rewrite the world's opinion of 3 words stamped on the back: made in Japan. From cheap junk to sleek, affordable, and better. And here is the quiet, fateful turn in the story, the part that rhymes with so many other American industries. The transistor radio market exploded into a gold rush. Big American radio companies with their factories and distribution rushed in with their own models, and the 2 small American pioneers who had actually created the thing, Texas Instruments and Regency, found they didn't have the capital to fight a price war in consumer radios against everyone at once. So within just a few years, they walked away. Regency retreated to commercial and industrial electronics. Texas Instruments simply left the consumer radio business altogether. It wasn't a tragedy for Texas Instruments, far from it. They took everything they'd learned and became a titan of the semiconductor age, making the chips inside computers and inventing the handheld calculator and the electronic watch. But the consumer electronics business, the radios and soon the tape players, the televisions, the stereos, flowed steadily across the Pacific to Japan. America had invented the device that started the portable electronics era and then handed the era itself to someone else. For the kid under the covers, none of that corporate drama mattered. What mattered was the price, and the price was falling like a stone. The first transistor radio had cost $50, but as Japanese factories poured out millions of them and competition drove prices down and the technology got cheaper to make, the transistor radio went from a luxury to a throwaway in barely a decade. $50 became $20, $20 became $10, and by the early 1970s, you could buy a basic little pocket AM radio for around $2. Pocket change, the kind of thing tossed into a drugstore bin or given away as a promotion. This is the $5 radio of the story, not the pioneering jewel of 1954, but the cheap, ubiquitous, democratized version that came after, the one that ended up in every kid's pocket and every kid's bed. The transistor radio stopped being a marvel and became simply part of growing up. Nearly every American child of the 1960s and 70s had one. It was the first piece of personal technology the whole country owned. The transistor radio didn't die in a bankruptcy or a scandal. It died the gentlest death of all. It was absorbed, one piece at a time, by the things that came after it. First, in 1979, Sony, the same company the little radio had built, released the Walkman. And suddenly, you could carry not just whatever a distant station happened to be playing, but your own music in real stereo, through real headphones. The thrill of hunting for a far-off signal gave way to the control of playing exactly what you wanted. Then, FM radio, with its clean sound, pulled listeners away from the crackly AM dial. Then cassettes, then CDs, then the iPod, and finally the smartphone, each one swallowing a little more of what the transistor radio used to be. Why hunt the dark for one faraway station when you could carry every song ever recorded in your pocket? By the time the phone arrived, the little AM pocket radio had quietly vanished from kids' hands. Nobody held a funeral. The function simply moved into a sleeker device, and the little box was forgotten. So what really vanished when the transistor radio disappeared? Not the function. In a sense, the transistor radio won so completely that it became invisible. The phone in your pocket is its direct descendant. Portable, personal, private, with an earphone in your ear and the whole world coming through it. The dream the little radio started, your own media, anywhere, just for you, came true beyond anyone's imagining. But something specific and tender was lost in the trade. We gained the whole world on demand, and we lost the wonder of catching a piece of it by accident. The phone gives you everything, instantly, with no effort and no surprise. The transistor radio gave you static and patience and the electric thrill of a single distant voice swimming up out of the dark. A thing you had to find, that you couldn't summon, that might fade away in a minute. It had limits, and the limits were the magic. A child today holds infinitely more in their hand, but almost none of them will ever lie awake in the dark, heart pounding, because they pulled a stranger's voice out of the night sky 1,000 miles away. For a few dollars, a child could once hold the whole world in one hand. It was cheap and tinny and ran on a battery, and it fit in the pocket or pressed against a pillow. It took radio off the living room wall and out of the family's control and gave it to you, your music, your station, your private world in one ear, in the dark, after everyone else was asleep. It set a generation of teenagers free with a soundtrack their parents couldn't switch off. It was the first true piece of personal technology any of us ever owned, and it was the small beginning of the Silicon Age that built everything we carry now. America invented it and let it go. Japan perfected it and conquered the world with it. The price fell from $50 to almost nothing until it sat in every kid's pocket and every kid's bed. And then, gently, completely, the things it had made possible grew up and swallowed it whole. The Walkman, the iPod, the phone, until the little box was gone and no one quite noticed. The world it brought you is still here, bigger and louder and more instant than ever. What's gone is the wonder of it, the patience, the static, the single faraway voice you had to hunt for in the dark, the feeling that you'd caught something out of the air with your own two hands. If you ever lay awake under the covers, earphone in, slowly turning the dial toward a city you'd never see, you remember. Subscribe, because there's another forgotten story already coming in over the air.